Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Great crowd. I'm Susan James, Assistant Director here at Bayless. And I have a few thank yous and a few events to mention. Of course, we want to thank James Ted Walker for speaking tonight and the Friends of the Library for the refreshments. We're very pleased to have Dr. Walker back with us tonight. He retired in 2011 after 40 years of teaching, 30 of which were at Ferris State University. He has a degree in history from Lake Superior State University and graduate degrees from Western Michigan and Florida State. This is Dr. Walker's 8th art history talk here at the library. Tonight his talk is on the beginnings of religion, about which he has just written a book. Please welcome Dr. Ted.
Thank you. This is indeed my 8th time here, and I wanted to say tonight, because I have not said it before, that working with Susan James is just a wonderful thing. She keeps you apprised of what's going on. You stop in, you ask for help, she's right there to give it, and it's I don't know if I would have continued to do this had it not been for her encouragement, and so it's been a good time, and I've enjoyed it throughout. Tonight, we're going to talk about the beginnings of religion, and it sounds like a huge topic, but actually, it's something that I think that we can handle. I can remember a number of years ago that a student asked me in one of my classes, what are we doing this for? This all happened thousands of years ago. Nobody's religious anymore. Why are we even bothering with this? And I asked him if he was reading the newspapers, and he said no, he never read the newspapers. And so I did point out that the 3 major religions in the West all worship the same God. If you go into the Quran, you can find Jesus Christ's name there. You can find Mary's name. You can find Abraham's name. Allah means the God. It's the same God. And yet, all 3 people from all 3 religions cheerfully kill each other on a regular basis. And it's not about God. It's about the way in which we worship God. It's about religion. It's about all of the stuff that we do in order to bring ourselves closer to God. And if you do it in a different way from somebody else, sometimes that makes them angry, and of course the center of all anger in the world can be found in the city of Jerusalem, where Christian, Muslim, and Jew live cheek to jowl. And if you even start a small road building project, it gets the other 2 very, very angry. And so to not recognize the importance of what religion has what the importance that it had on our society, and even today into the modern world, is to just ignore something that everyone should know about. And sometimes when you watch Americans over in places like Iraq and in other countries, we are so absolutely abysmally ignorant of the way in which they conduct themselves. And in our country, many of us are not religious. And I thought, when I was talking to that student, that probably today he reads trending topics on his computer, and so he could probably tell you what Kim Kardashian wore yesterday. But if he was asked to talk at all about faith in America and how it's come about and where we are in the world today, just wouldn't know. And the idea is sometimes I think that if it's old, it's not worth knowing. And so tonight, what we're going to do is start at what most believe is the first piece of religious art. All right? This is found in the Grand Cave at Lascaux, of which I think there is only one of us here who has actually been in. It is now closed. But I'm pretty sure that you did not see this, because in order to get to this, you have to slide down a 25-foot shaft holding onto a rope. And when you get down there, there's only enough room for about 2 people. So this particular work of art was not done as the others in these caves were, in which you can see these magnificent images of animals as they're moving across the walls and across the ceilings. This is a place that was meant for only 1 or 2 people. So, what was it for? When they first found it and they looked at it, they thought what it seemed to show was a hunting scene. But in prehistoric art, prehistoric cave art, it is extraordinarily rare to find an image of a human being. They're all animals. They're all animals. And I think we've talked a little bit about that before here. And so they begin to re-examine this. And that figure that you see there, who seems to be falling backwards or perhaps even lying on his back, has, with what appears to be a scream on his face, has dropped this. It's come out of his hand. It is a staff with a bird emblem on the top of it. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that there is a bull. And the bull has been pierced by a spear, and you can see its entrails are sort of emptying out just before it would die. The study on this has come up with this particular idea, and because it has been repeated, this kind of thing has been repeated in art that came after, they think they have a pretty good idea what this is. That this is a shaman figure. A figure who in prehistory would have been a single individual in a tribe who claimed to have the ability to influence events in a way that that no single hunter in the tribe or no single individual in the tribe could do. He had the ability to bring to these people the animals that they needed to kill in order to survive. Now, it's just a small thing, but what it seems to suggest is that there are individuals and that there are powers beyond what is the normal human experience. And these individuals, as long as they were successful and as long as they could bring animals in, I guess kept their job, and the moment everyone went hungry, they went looking for another one. But if you look at this, the idea seems to be here that in this shaft, in this place where he would have gone then to experience this particular kind of I don't want to say otherworldly experience, in which he brought these animals in and therefore made it possible for his people to eat and survive. This gave him power that none of the rest had. Now, if you look at it, it's a pretty basic idea. It's a single human being claiming to have powers that no one else has. But there's no God here. All right? There's nothing like that. There just is that particular image. When you see ones that followed, you come across this rather puzzling creature. And in truth, it's not nearly as, when you see it on the wall, it's not nearly as well defined as this. This has been raised and so that certain parts of it, yes, if you look, the feet are human, all right? But the rest of the body is of various kinds of animals, 2 different kinds of deer, it appears to be. A face that could be either a fox or an owl, depending, the horse of the body, and the rest. And so in this particular instance, what they believe is that this is another one of these shaman characters who has been able, by taking on the appearance of these animals, then to bring them into the hunters, so that the hunters will then be successful and will then be able to, they'll be able to survive. Now, remember that we talked about this last time, but these tribal units generally ran somewhere between 25 and 35. All right, so this individual would have been extraordinarily important, and there would have been 2 individuals more important than all the rest. The best hunter and the one that provided the means for the hunt. But still, in terms of religion, all this is the activities of a solitary individual who is attempting then to convince everybody else that he can do things that others cannot do. Well, you might say, well, that doesn't have much to do with us, but would there be a Catholic here? A Catholic? If you were to have sinned horribly last night, did something that none of us should ever hear or talk about, there is within the Catholic experience the opportunity to speak to your priest, Who then has the power to? Absolve you. All right? And so this isn't, it's a big jump from this to there, but the notion of certain individuals set apart who can do these things was there. It just was there. But the thing that is, I think, the most interesting part of religion are the rituals and the things that we go through when we go to church that talk about the possibility of existence after death. That one did not appear in any of the art. This dated between 16 and 18,000 years ago. And there was then this long period of time, which is about 14,000 years in duration, which is a long time. Keep in mind, folks, that George Washington was walking around 300 years ago, and we just think he's so ancient that, you know, and these are thousands of years, not hundreds of years. So there wasn't anything in that space to let us know what was happening. There were some small female figurines that suggested that they believed, all of them indicating that they're with child, that seemed to suggest then that if you carried one of these, you might get pregnant, that kind of thing, but nothing much more than that. And then, folks, about a decade ago, a farmer was pushing a stick plow through some of the roughest ground in all of Turkey, in an area where the temperature in the summer runs to 120 to 125 degrees, and he hit the top of a limestone rock. He didn't know what it was. He cleaned it off a little bit. He notified some people. They notified the University of Chicago, which sent out their crack archaeological team, looked it all over and said, there's nothing here, and they went back home. A man by the name of Schmidt from Germany, he came and looked it over and said, I think there might be something here. So, let's have a look. This is the location of the place called Göbekli Tepe. And this is the piece that is right in the middle. When they dated what they found on this hill here, they could not believe the date. It was 11,000 years before our time. 11,000 years. And yet it was so incredibly advanced, the art was so amazingly advanced, that they ran other individuals running tests out to make sure that the dating was right, and every time they dated it, they actually pushed it back a few years. And so Germany now has the lead in the excavation of this and the way it goes. Now I want to point out that we're close to some places. All right? Places that we all know of as is in the area that was called the Fertile Crescent, where an individual who will come along about 8,000 years after this, you may have heard of him, his name was Abraham. All right? Keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, what I'm going to show you first is an artist's rendition of what this looks like. These ones right here are 15 to 18 feet tall. They are carved out of crystalline limestone. Mr. Doherty has helped me out a little bit with that just before here, which is extremely hard, and they were carved before we had metal implements to do it. So they're using harder rocks to carve these rocks. These things weigh, few of them, over 10 ton. And yet they have built it up. And by the way, Göbekli Tepe in Turkish means the rounded belly. And they should have known. The people from the University of Chicago should have known. It's in a large, kind of flat, open plain, and there is this big hill. And it just is there. And if they had bothered to move the dirt around a little bit, they would have found that it had already been dug out. And the reason that this thing has survived to this point in time is that it didn't sit up there and was abandoned and the winds came in and covered it up. That's not what happened at all. For some reason, about 1,500 years after they built it, they buried it. They just buried it, and no one has a clue as to why. But this image, which I think appeared in perhaps on the National Geographic site here a few years ago, is already completely out of date. If I can go back to this map without completely messing up the computer image, they now believe that this is a shrine that goes to the north for 50 miles. That this isn't a single temple at all. It's an immense complex of temples. And what they have done is gone over it with ground penetrating radar, and they're beneath the soil, and they have been covered up and therefore preserved. So what exactly is going on here? Well, Schmidt is very careful in what he has to say about this. And he's kind of a crafty old guy. He has turned this into a tourist attraction. When I was there in Turkey about 3 or 4 years ago, there was just this horribly old, broken down, rusty bus. Now there are nice big air-conditioned buses for Americans with a buffet. We'll take you out to the site. Of course, they're tromping around out there, but he is using the money from the tourists to help actually fund this project. He believes, just in this one area that he is working, that it will not be completed for better than 50 years. And so he's an old man, he won't finish it. But he will not allow this site to be compromised. So, well, here, let's just look at it. Let's just look at it. There is no archaeological site on the face of planet Earth today that has so many people just interested. Every archaeology student in the United States is trying to get the opportunity to go over to Turkey and with a toothbrush and a spoon spend the entire semester in 100-degree temperatures trying to work their way through the dirt. The stones are, the ones that have been broken are very close together. They're putting them back up, and they're trying to figure out what this was all about. They're in a circle, all right? For those of you who have been to Stonehenge, you know all about that. But Stonehenge is thousands of years after this place. It's a considerable distance away. And so what this means in terms of early religion was a mystery for a while. And then Schmidt, taking all of the evidence, dropped a bomb here, I guess about 2 years ago, when he challenged every person who has written a history book about this period. He said, "You're all wrong." That's a wonderful way to start, by the way, when you're trying to get funding for these things. But what he said was this. He said that we used to think that hunters, gatherers, all right, New Stone Age people had gradually moved into river valleys, and they had started to farm. And as they farmed and towns and cities began to grow up, that what they did then was become religious people. That's when they began to identify gods and so on. Schmidt said, that's wrong. What happened was these people were doing this long before there were ever any cities. That what they were doing, they were hunters and gatherers, they were working the land, they were killing animals, they were doing exactly what had been going on 5,000 years ago when they were painting on the walls in Lascaux. What they did was to build this temple, and nobody lived there. They have searched in vain for fire pots where people would have made food. There just aren't any. This was a place where you came to worship. And Schmidt believes that what happened was that these temples became gathering places, and from these gathering places, that's when people began to settle down and they began to farm the areas around them. But not quite in the way that you might think. Now, let's just wander through this a little bit. This is it gives you some idea, but it looks much rockier than it really is. It's kind of a vast open plain. Look at this. People without metal tools, carving on these stylized things, and if you go around to the other side, there's often a human being on the other side with his hands in this kind of a position like this. So when you look at this, you try to figure out what it is they were doing. Why are they making it this way? When they lined them all up and tried to see if in fact these individuals were worshipers of some celestial god, there wasn't anything out there in the direction. But you know, this isn't the days of the Leakeys and those first explorers who were, you know, trying to dig skulls out and trying to make sense of things. There are climatologists now, and there are people who specialize in astrology and where the stars were in relations to things. It's a completely different thing now. And when they looked at where the stars were in position, this 11,000 years ago, it lined right up with the star cluster Cygnus. And so they began to believe now that what these people had done for a long time is they had been worshiping, and the god that they were worshiping was celestial. It was all right, not a bad idea. They threw that out there. Some people bought it, some people didn't, but they just kind of kept going. And then Schmidt said, well, you know, when you look at these circles, the animals and things that are depicted on the outside are things that can harm you, things that can attack you. There are lions, there are wild boars, there's all sorts of things like that. Whereas on the inside, there are animals that are no threat at all. And so he suggested that maybe what we're looking at here is the first attempt to separate a place that is good from a place that is outside, threatening, and therefore evil. Now look, when you pick up the Bible and you read Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, and you start reading the second story about Adam and Eve, that's a story about good and evil. For a religion to survive, there has to be some notion of what is good and what is not good. And so Schmidt said, well, you know, I'm not saying this is the way it is, but I'm just saying that this is a possibility. Well, since then they have uncovered all sorts of other things, and that one is still being talked about, thought about. Here's a larger view of this. You can see that the students, who all have bad sunburns, walk along this, and then they crawl down into those pits, and they work and they love it. Look at these huge stylized human hands, and these figures are oh, and by the way, beneath these 15-foot pieces of statuary, beneath them is another set of 15 foot. This was built on top of that. So this is a big deal. These people would have had to give up time in order to build them. There would have had to have been a class of people that had begun to do this kind of thing, but they were still hunters and gatherers. That's what they were. Wild boar. Here. So, on the outside, lizards with teeth, always to be avoided. Well, look, completely separate from Schmidt is another group of people who are working on this. A long time ago, archaeologists learned a lesson. There was a man by the name of Schliemann who went into the story of the war at Troy. And he went looking through the pages and he said, you know, I'll bet that Troy existed. I think that maybe using the story from the Iliad, we could actually find out where it is. And of course, scientists, many of them stodgy people who have written their books and don't want anything to change that, they were very, very critical of him. They laughed at him, and of course he found it. And not only did he find Troy, but he found 11 Troys built right on top of each other. And so a long time ago, scientists have stopped criticizing people who use literary sources to find things. And in the last number of years, moving out from Israel and moving out and around, they have been using the Bible to see if they can't find some of these ancient cities that have been ended and abandoned and have been under the sands. And of course, you can't see them when you're walking over them, but satellite imagery can see them. And sometimes airplanes with photography that looks down can see them. And they have found in the Bible 5 cities that are under the sands that no one knew were even there. And so, somebody made a suggestion. That's all it was. Let's take a look here. It is an argument that has found its way into serious academic journals. This is a place that is, of course, 11,000 years old. It is not very far from Mount Ararat, which of course you can find mention of in the Bible. Somebody said, well, what if this was a place that was so rich that it wasn't like every other place on the face of the earth? Well, if people who go there say that it's just desolate. But climatologists have discovered that 10,000 years ago, this was a place where rivers flowed through. It had a climate that was warm, but not horribly hot. The soil was rich. Things grew along the river. And no less an authority than Spencer Wells, who, of course, is the great expert on the reading of DNA and the rest, and have kind of worked his way through here, calls this area that runs here and across over into southern Russia the meat locker of antiquity. That there were more animals there, animals that would be easy to kill. That the people who lived in and around this area, on this plain, had perhaps the most beautiful spot on the face of the earth, and that there were, for them, it was a fairly easy life. Now, you've got to be very careful here, because there are people who will just jump and say, wow, we've just found the Garden of Eden, that's just what it is. But more serious people have said, look, what would be, is it possible that in the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, what you really have is a description of a place that had been here and then had, for whatever reason, lost its value, and people had moved away. That it's a metaphor for a beautiful place where no one had to work very hard. People could hunt. It could be done easily. Life would have been very good. And that if you were trying to develop a story about good and evil, why not place those people in such a place? That the story that you get in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis, they argue, could have used this as a backdrop for that story. Wow, that you can imagine. There were just all sorts of angry responses that that's unscientific, that's just nonsense. But what we do know about this is that about 7,000 years before our time, that the climate changed in this area. That the two of the rivers went underground and have disappeared. They can find them by area. The Gihon and Fizon rivers. They can still find them by aerial photography, but they don't run anymore. The animals, of course, not able now to sustain themselves by living in this particular area, left. Now, that's okay, but people who like this idea that this is a metaphor for the story that appears in Genesis, there are two really peculiar lines in the book of Genesis. When Adam was tossed out of the Garden of Eden, do you remember what his punishment was? To bruise his heel in the fields. That's what it was. And there is this curious verse, and I will read it. It says this: God says to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all of the days of your life." History had always said that human beings, when they became farmers, that life got better. Schmidt is saying that's not true at all. Farming's hard work. Is there anybody here who's ever lived on a farm? Farming is hard work. And that what they had been doing before was much less work. It provided them with much more. So in this story, people are tossed out. Now, there are different thoughts on this. The thoughts could be that, what in heavens happened here?
When you moved the Bible, Ted, it went
Let
there be light.
There was light. All right. We'll stop fooling around with the miraculous here, but at any rate, I don't know what to think about any of that. I really don't. The whole notion of this place being a metaphor, I just don't know. But what I do know is that people are talking about it. It's in journals. You can read them. You can, if you look into any scientific journal today, they're talking about this. And if nothing else, that's very good, because it focuses for us on where we came from. And it is my understanding that next year this place, the UN is rushing in to call it a National Heritage Site before they've even dug it out and they even know what it is. But at any rate, what you have here is this fascinating notion that these people were extraordinarily religious. So if they built this, and this is what it's for, what could have been the reason? Well, one of the things that Schmidt has done is he has enumerated the numbers of animals that appear on this. And there are an extraordinary number of vultures placed on these stones all around. Now, that one, there is a connection. In local religion, here in Turkey, there is stories then of vultures delivering the bodies of the dead to the gods. Now, I suspect that what the vultures were doing were taking a chunk of the body and delivering it to another place. But the notion then of the corpse being stripped of its flesh and then taken away has been a myth, a story that has existed in this part of the world for a very, very long time. And I don't, if this is the kind of thing that you are interested in, just take a quick look at a faith that developed in Persia about this time under the name of a man by the name of Zoroaster, where the climactic tale in this, part of this is that when individuals die, these things come in and take the bodies away and let them go. So, here we have this incredible notion now that human beings live on, that they live on past the time of their death, that they are taken someplace else. So, how could they have possibly have bought that? How could they possibly believe that? Well, that one seems to be fairly easy to explain. All of these people who were hunters knew one thing, and that was that dead was dead. You killed something, you went back the next day, it was still there, it was rotting, dead is dead. Nothing else happens. But at the same time, if your father passed away or your mother passed away and you knew that she was dead, and yet while you slept, she appeared to you in dreams, there was no explanation for dreams for these people. There were no people in the area of psychology or medicine to explain how that works. For them, it only seemed then that the dead who had been dead and were still dead seemed to exist in another way, in another form somewhere else. So the notion then of an afterlife is already pretty clearly being discussed here 11,000 years ago. They are building these incredible temples that run 50 miles. And in America, we're making people take down anything that looks religious, even a manger scene at Christmas, because we find it offensive, if they only knew. So, another aspect of early religion, 4,000 years ago, 6 to 7,000 years after Göbekli Tepe. This is a ziggurat. It is, I believe, the one referred to in the Bible as coming near the city of Ur. The Americans, while they were here, this was a passageway to, as they traveled around Iraq fighting. Heavy American tanks have gone through this, gone around it, and in the last 10 years, this thing has sunk 14 feet. These tanks are, and they shake the ground and they brought it down. This is an interesting looking thing. You notice there are no doors. All right, people lived out here. They did not live in there. There was a priest class that lived in here, and now a completely new element in religion. Right up at the top, which is now gone, there was a place where it was a shrine. It was a place where then individuals could come then to offer up things. Inside here, this was a huge open bay. It wasn't broken up into rooms. It's a huge open bay. You can't go in there now because it's dangerous. But in times when these people felt threatened, animals would be brought inside, and then they would be safe, and then when the danger passed out, they would come. But it is interesting how this worked. And I think if you think about this, you will make a connection with something that you have heard in your churches all your lives. When you have a shrine in a place where you believe that there are many gods, all right, where there are many, many gods, you come and you want to leave an offering and make a prayer at one of these because you want something. You want a beautiful woman, you want more money, you want this, you want that. And so you come to the God and you make that prayer. And then you turn around and leave. But here's the thing. What happens to the wealth that you have brought when you leave? Where does that go? Well, it goes to the people who collect it. And since the only way you felt that you might get one of these things was to actually make your prayer and make your donation, then the people who worked this site would have become incredibly powerful. This was a temple where money was exchanged. This was a place where people who had little gave it to people who had lots. Now, if you think about this, when the Jews built their first temple, long time after that, remember, people who wandered up and down and through here were a group of people called the Irabu. All right, that's what they were known as. The Irabu were those people who later we called the Hebrew. All right, they saw this. They saw this. And so I'm trying to think of whether it's Wednesday or Thursday. Jesus Christ, in one of the few examples in the Bible where he just becomes absolutely furious, does so for what reason? Money exchanges being done in the Jewish temple. The whole notion then that the worship of God was designed to enrich people, to make people more powerful, was something that Christ especially found to be horrifying. And so he turned over tables and caused all sorts of problems. Think about this for just a moment, all right? The Irabu, they are these people they're just goat herders. They're pushing animals through the dry part of the desert. They get from one place to another to get water. They feed them where they can. They trade their animals for whatever it is they need to survive. And that's what they do. That's how they go. And in these places, they think and they talk about their religion. And what they determine in these conversations that would have occurred around campfires and all the rest was that they believed that there was only a single God. A single God. Can you imagine how unpopular that would make them? Because if people are getting extraordinarily wealthy through the worship of many gods, if there's only one God, you only have to stop by with your offering one time. Now, what happens is that they can build shrines all over, and it begin to separate people from the very wealthy, the priestly class, and the ones that ruled, down to the people who had very little at all. This is one of those places. Abraham would have seen this place. He would have known about this place. And as the story goes in the Bible, and you can work your way through Genesis and then in Exodus if you want, it is Abraham who prays, seeing himself living in the midst of this. And God says, well, all right, if you're going to be the only one who thinks this way, let us develop between us a covenant, an agreement that you will be the people that I choose, because you're the only one of all of the people who thinks this way. And they have, of course, suffered for that decision for a very, very long time. The steps that would take you up to this, it's just close to being in a state of collapse. This one I'm not going to spend a terrible amount of time on. It's just so that our timeline is good here. It's about 3,000 years old, this. But there is an interesting jump here. Pyramids were designed, the leading Egyptologists now tell us, were designed in order then to mimic the rays of the sun as they came down and they struck the earth. But that isn't certainly enough reason to build something like this. The Jews would have known about this too. They would have seen these things, and not only that, they would have worked on them. You may remember that it is Moses then who leads his people out from this particular experience. But at any rate, they are a place where the dead could be brought in. And we can just show you that. Here, Anubis weighs the soul, the righteous, and here it's heart in one, other in the other, and then on he goes, hopefully, and it is always shown as moving across a river. The body is taken and sometimes scratched into the wall, as you see it here. We tend to look at this and say, well, this is for really important people. This is for pharaohs. But of course, there were many, many smaller tombs for just ordinary people. And the idea was that your soul is moved from one particular place to a higher spiritual realm that you go there. So the idea then of an experience after death starts to become an absolutely central part of religious belief. Now look, who here is wearing around their neck, there must be at least one, a cross? Anyone wearing a cross? Ah. That is, of course, a symbol that in its day you would never worn around your neck. The Latin word is crux, and it was a word that men never spoke of in the presence of women. It described a death so horrible and so ghastly that you just didn't talk about it. But when you wear it around your neck, it is a symbol of triumph, correct? And it is also a symbol of direction, and it suggests then that you are protected. You believe in this, and so therefore you are protected, and you wear it. This idea of a life after death most certainly influenced the Hebrews as they were slaves and worked on these tombs. They could not have helped that. And if you read the story of Exodus carefully, when Moses eventually leads them out, and that's about 1400 years ago, by the way, as they work their way out into the desert, that at times they just don't last. Their faith breaks down. And you may, for any of you that have been in a church at all, know the story of the golden calf and all that. This notion of life after death becomes a central feature of every major Western religion. Think back to where we were about 45 minutes ago, where you had a guy in a cave trying to get some animals to come in. Things have moved along. So I thought, since I know that some of you have been here, that I would show you this. This, of course, is Stonehenge. It is about 45 minutes from London, if you go down through Salisbury, on the scariest double-decker bus you will ever ride in your entire life. But when you get there, it's out in the middle of the field, and there are huge burial mounds all around it, but the English government has decided not to excavate those. And there is so much there that would tell us so much more about this, but they're just not going to do it. That's just the way it is. When you look at this, when you consider it for just a moment, how could it have been used for a religious purpose, but also as a way of gaining power over lots and lots of people? If I were to tell my sister-in-law here that all she had to do was to put down this number of power balls, or whatever they're called, and that she was going to win the big jackpot, and then it happened, she would probably respect my opinion more than she does at this current time. What the priests who operated this some time ago, and by the way, they have now backed this up. We used to think this was about 2,000 years old. They now think it's 3,000, and there are people that are pushing it back further than the pyramids. But the interesting thing about this is that as the sun moved in the sky and the light struck these stones, of course, the shadows moved like this. And somebody put together that when the shadows were in a particular place, that's where spring came the next year. And so then, because you're paying attention to this and no one else is, you announce that this horrible winter is over. Boy, would this work in the Sioux. This horrible winter is over, and you can expect the sun to warm the ground, and you can go back to tilling the soil. And then it happens. And then it happens. And they are overwhelmed by the fact that you know this. But that, of course, is not all that Stonehenge was all about. When you line up the entrance part of this, and I've turned myself around here, which is here, I believe. No, it's here. It's heel stone here. And you come through here, there is a small area where there's a stone here and a stone here, and there is a gap in here. On the time during the year when the sun and the moon come together, when they come together, these people were worshipers of that certainly too. That is the time then of the big festival when it is said the priests would move in and sacrifices would be made and all that kind of stuff went on. So here you have a place that has multiple uses. The ziggurat, well, you gave sacrifice and they made money. Now, that's the way it worked out. But in this particular instance, you have this. Now, the more that they dig, and of course now they're out here and they're digging around in rings. And of course, if you travel to England, I think about 40 miles to north in Avebury, there was another one of these things, only it was made out of wood, and so it's not nearly as well preserved. They now believe that these things are pretty much all over England. Most of the time they were made out of wood, and for that reason they have not survived. But this one is far more elaborate, and the story of how it was put together and all that is for another night. But here you have this notion then that a monument that is a religious monument could be used to control people by the way in which it was constructed and the way in which the shadows moved, and of course you gain control. And all around this thing, of course, are buried local kings and important people, and they ran the show. So, what do we have here? What we have, I believe, is that we are far more religious than most of us think we are. The things that we believe in, what's good and what isn't good, oftentimes come from our experiences with religion. That it still alters our lives. Where are our Catholics again? If you are a Catholic, and it appears as though your new leader has some very interesting ideas about changing the way in which you worship, and there are some people that like it, and some people who dress in red who don't like it at all. And so, if this changes, it becomes a different way to worship. Certain things are emphasized over other things. It is hard to say what is going to happen then to Catholic peoples. For those of you who've been following what's happening to Episcopalians right now, and the battle, do we have an Episcopalian in here? Okay, they are in the midst of a horrible battle over how they ought to worship, and it has torn their faith almost completely in half. Still continues, folks, to influence the way in which we are. There is such a tiny difference between a Shiite and a Sunni. It is so small. It is the difference between something that happened between a nephew of Muhammad and a friend of Muhammad a long time ago. It was never meant, and yet today they are slaughtering each other, and they're slaughtering each other's children. We talk about this wonderful Arab Spring, democracy everywhere, everybody's going to be like us. It's not going to happen that way. If you have any sense of how religion has developed in that part of the world, it's just not going to happen that way. So, do you have questions for me? Yeah.
When you say 3,000 or 1,400, you mean from right now?
The dating of these things, and you've got to watch it. The 11,000 year date, I'll go back to Tepe, for instance. If you were using the dating system that you're probably BC and AD, you would say it is 9,000 years before Christ. And then, of course, there's another 2,000 years after that. That is why I prefer to say 11,000, because the dating's more accurate. People who don't like, who are not religious and resent the fact that all of their dating has to be based on a mention of the birth of Jesus Christ, like instead what is called BCE, before the Common Era. all right? And so that's how they do it. Most of the dates that I have given you tonight are not BC, but rather before our time, before, okay? Yeah?
You implied or said that there were no food or other tools found around that site, but in order to build it, workers would have had to have been there and would have had to have left
Oh, yeah.
things.
If I said that, I didn't mean to say it that way. The tools that have been found are tools for working, chipping away at stone and the rest. The tools that I was referring to were cooking tools, the kind of tools that would have been used in the making and preparing of food. At other ancient sites in Turkey, they have found places like that, but there are burn circles and all
Well, I
the
would
rest.
think you would still have to have a lot of workers and they'd have to eat.
Right, but they would have come, Schmidt believes they would have come at times of festivals. Food would have been prepared for them, and they would have eaten it as the festival, and then they would have left. All right? Look, when you go to Mecca today, you don't partake of meals or anything else when you go inside the great shrine there. That's all outside. And so this appears to be a shrine set apart from normal living.
Well, that would be after it was constructed. I'm talking about the
Right.
construction phase, which would
Right.
obviously have to take
Right.
considerable
Even
amount of time.
for the one thing that Schmidt maintains is that in all of the work that he has done, he has not found a single one of those cook fire.
You're talking like permanent or permanent habitation.
Right. He just does not believe, and he's a pretty careful old guy, and reporters run over there and they have questions, they want to jump to this conclusion. He's not having any of it. Anything else? Yes.
The Tepe place
Yeah.
in Turkey, they didn't find any evidence of a worship of a particular god or a single god or anything like that. So it seems like the earliest religions or the earliest beliefs of man were that there was a male and a female god that existed together, and then as religion evolved, it became just one god, which was a male god. And why did like the Romans and the Greeks, they had goddesses and
Right,
gods.
or much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did that fit in these earlier sites?
What you're mentioning, of course, comes a lot later, but let me try to answer your question this way. You can't find anybody who worships in the way that is here today. There are no permanent religions that have evolved coming out of there, come out of these sites. The only permanent religion that came out of this were from those goat pushers called the Irabu, who made their faith intellectual. One of the first things that they did was to try to determine where sin came from. Because if there's only one God and God creates it all, and God is good, then there shouldn't be sin. And they worked at this for a very long time. Now, the book of Genesis was written about 500 years ago. All right? But the stories in Genesis went way back. All right? If you get to Abraham and the mention of Abraham in the Bible, it mentions him. He's about 4,000 years back from us. But there, in the little begat section that comes right before that, it goes back 10 generations. So these people had talked about this, and finally what they decided was that God didn't create evil. What God did was give man a choice. He gave them free will. And in the choices that they made, that's where evil came from. Now, see, you don't see that kind of profound ideas in any of this other kind of thing. You don't see it there. The Hebrew examination of the world is profound. Of course, you still have Hebrew schools that study this kind of thing. And they made a decision, made 4 decisions actually, that just changed the nature of the way in which we worship. They argued that there was one God. They argued that God was a loving God, that He loved human beings, He didn't punish them, that God had an order that we can understand if we work to try to understand it. Remember the Greek word for the order all around us? It's a cosmos. It can be figured out. If with God's help, we can figure it out. The idea of a loving God who lived in an ordinary world and provided for His people, this is the last, a system of justice, a way of living so they could live with one another. And of course, it's right after that Moses comes down and provides us with 10 ways of getting along with each other and carrying out justice. The Jews and the Hebrews and what it is that they did, their faith was just so much more intellectually powerful than all of what was around them that it just changed the way. And of course, there are 3 major religions in the West today, and they all come from the conversations among those people working their way. They weren't in beautiful temples. They were just goat herders talking to each other and thinking and writing it down. Yes.
I heard a program on NPR last week, which is a source of a lot of my information, and this fellow has been many religions, and studies religions intensely, and he said, God is almost beyond our comprehension, beyond words, so far beyond us, and that religions are basically different languages. They're just a bunch of different languages for talking about the unspeakable, the unfathomable. And he was really trying to say that, we really shouldn't be fighting each other, that they're just different languages, just different pathways, just different visions for the unspeakable. I mean,
yes.
how can you say, well, this is what God is right over here?
Well, the Muslims don't have any trouble with that. If you read how each of the 3 faiths describe God, the most distant figure in all of them is in Islam, and it's right in the Quran. God is to man as a master is to a servant. There is no closer relationship between God and man than among the Christians. And here you have God sending a son, a part of Him, a person who walked among human beings. This is an idea that Muslims just find to be torturous, hate it, all right, despise it. They view Christ as a major prophet, the 3rd major prophet of Islam. If you look at the Jews, it's somewhere in between. The notion then of a loving God, but still distant, who provides ways in which you can get through your life. But the whole notion in Christianity of this loving figure who took the little children into His lap, who sacrificed for other people, that's a radical idea and brings the notion of God much closer to people than the other 2. So I find his answer to that question a little vanilla, if you want to know the truth. It sort of denies that there's differences, and that's just not true. It's just not true.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly disagree with that, sir. But there is vanilla, but there's also cinnamon, and there's also lots of different other flavors within us, and we don't necessarily get along because we are a little bit different flavor.
Well, right, but I agree with you completely. But the notion in the 3 faiths of what is the faith of God, it's not all the same. But the notion here that you would think that people could find a way, if they worship the same God, to tolerate the faiths of others.
Yeah.
I think that we try to do that. Maybe in America we come a little closer than they do in other places, but yeah.
Well, they have in Eastern Europe, in the Urals, in that area, for centuries, and families intermarried amongst the religions. So
yes.
They looked at the the overlords such as Tito as the common enemy.
Yep.
However, the radical fringe of all three religions look at wiping the others off the face. Where if you go to the core of the moderates and where the wellspring of Abraham and his children and that love comes from, they do have that tolerance.
I
So
think you're absolutely right. If I had to comment on it, I would say this, that Islam is a much younger religion than is Christianity, and certainly than is Judaism. Christianity went through its radical phase, something that the Arabs have not forgiven us for, and they still refer to Americans as crusaders. You know,
Well,
maybe religions evolve as in the same way that people evolve. Maybe in the future, what you're talking about is a possibility, but right now there's a lot of people making bombs.
Oh no, that's true.
Yeah,
Can you clear something up for me? And
I can try.
when did the Jewish people get a bad rap? Is it when they crucified Jesus?
No, they have always been a people apart. They wandered around through the Middle East for centuries, pushing this idea of one God. And that cut at the economic basis of all the other religions. And you ought to consider too that Muhammad, who also advocated the notion of a single God, they were trying to kill him, and he finally fled. In Islam, it's referred to as the Hijra. He finally fled. He went 50 miles north to the city of Medina, and there built up a power base, and then came back and took things over. But the people who advocate that kind of a notion in a world where everything else is completely different. Well, you know, how many Jews were put up on crosses because of their insistence that there was one God in a Roman world when there were many gods among the Romans. Yeah.
Couldn't you argue then that basically all Western religion is just politics?
It has been political.
Well, I mean,
Not all of
politics
it.
and power.
Not all of it. I think, yeah, but the alliance between political power and religion is
But what I'm trying to get at is, I mean, they use God and the afterlife and whatnot as, I mean, as basically to describe and, well, an opiate for, well, what I'm saying is it's going to get better on the next time. Well, I'm not a Marxist, I'll say that, but I've read parts of the manifesto.
Yeah. In Russia, certainly the church was used in that way. Not everywhere.
The stories you described, though, I mean,
Yes.
it all hinges on power of a few to control them.
Not all of it, but some of it certainly, yes. Yes, I mean, it's just undeniable.
Okay.
Yes.
How did Akhenaten become a monotheist?
Oh,
He got in a lot of trouble.
yes, he
Was
did.
he
And-
influenced by the Jews? Or
No,
were the Jews
he's
influenced
a
by him?
sun worshiper, but and to go through that story would take us another hour, and I think that people are eyeing up the cookies here. But remember what Akhenaten did. Recognizing that his life might be in danger, he completely changed the capital of Egypt, moved into the center, right in the middle of the desert, built a big, beautiful place where he could, and then all around him, he had opposition. Yes.
There are a lot of similarities between Eastern and Western religion, and I'm wondering if you studied the basis of Eastern religion and which came first?
The answer to that question is no. And if you have questions about Eastern religion, I am not the one to answer. What I can tell you is that because there is a heavy university presence in the West, that there has been a much more detailed study of the origins of Western religions than there has been of Eastern religions. It is not to say that there wasn't an equally dynamic religious experience going on there. It's just that we don't know as much about it.
Well, when people settled, I understand from the DNA search that
Mhm.
people originated in Africa
Mhm.
and then spread out. I mean, did they spread out? I can't remember if they went to India first or if they went up.
Along the coast of Italy, along the coast of India, worked their way out, and then island hopped to Australia. That's what Spencer Wells found. That particular branch of humanity was a little different from the branch that stayed in the center of Russia and worked its way up into Europe. They have generally referred to as Homo erectus. They're just a little bit different, so what they believed, I'm not sure anyone knows. I'm not sure there's any evidence to let anybody know. Yes?
Does every major religion, including the Jewish faith, believe in an afterlife?
You're referring to the Western?
Yes.
The three major Western religions?
Right.
Yes, yes. How you get there is different. The Muslims refuse to acknowledge intercessors. Christ, they see the putting somebody that you have to accept this in order to get here. They just completely reject that notion.
What about the Jews? Do they believe in an afterlife?
Yes, very much so. Not as well explained and not in the kind of detail that it is essentially an association with God. If you remember that there are a number of Jewish texts that go beyond the Old Testament of the Bible, all sorts of discussions and the rest that have been written down, and this is what Jewish students study at their in their schools, and it's an interesting notion. They posit questions like, what is paradise? How are we to think about paradise? I think that there's less emphasis on it among the Christians as sort of a physical place you go to, a heaven. Yes?
I would say it emphasizes life and experiencing life.
Right.
And the joy of being with others and existence.
Right. That is also found among the Christians. One only has to read the Paradise of Dante's Inferno, where they're all on a big rose and all together. Yeah.
What cartoon characters on your band?
It appears to be. I have grandchildren. It appears to be a wicked witch. Bill, did you have a question? Yes.
Which way do you lean in terms of the holy text? Do you lean toward metaphor or something else? In terms of the text themselves, do you see them as metaphors to explain everything, or do you? Which way do you go?
The Bible has, of course, many different authors, and was put together over a long period of time in different places. The Old Testament Bible is written that way. Different authors employ different methods of getting their point across. Metaphor is one of those ways. Folks, if you've never done this, pick up the Bible and just all you have to read is four little chapters. I mean, yeah. And there are two creation stories. Okay? You can read them. Man gets created, the animals gets created, God does all that he does, and then on chapter 2, verse 4, he turns around and does it again. There are two creation stories back to back. But the second one names the created people. It names what they did, talks about what they did. And it talks about how their sin caused human beings to live the way we do. All right? Now, our Adam and Eve, who of course would have been far distant time from whether he meant them to stand for actual people who were created, or was rather using the notion here to show that two people were given a clear direction by God. This is how you need to live. And they chose not to do it. And so every sin that there is actually only one sin. It's the sin of rebellion. They were told what to do, and they chose to do something else. If the Adam and Eve story is a metaphor, it's a very good one. Because it explains to us, anyone who reads it, what God expects of us. If it is caught up in stories about the beginning of things that come down, then it is a historical item. Because if you read it carefully, if you read Genesis carefully, they aren't hardly out of the garden until they start mentioning people who live off to the east and people who live off the west and that kind of thing. And so it really seems to me that it is that Genesis is an instructional device. It lets us know in the clearest possible way, that the first creation story doesn't, by the way, what it is that is expected of us. Kind of a Weasley answer. Folks, I think that the library people would probably like to get home. Listen, thank you so much.